Good morning, everyone in press corps. Good morning to the people of the Cayman Islands. My name is Kristen Suku. I'm the Acting Chief Officer in the Ministry of Education, Employment, and Gender Affairs. I will serve as your moderator today. We've called this press conference today to discuss the minimum wage setting for the Cayman Islands, to present formally to the people of this country the report of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, to discuss its recommendations and implementation. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel today. We have the Honorable Premier of the Cayman Islands, Mr. Alden McLaughlin. We have the Minister for Education, Employment and Gender Affairs, Honorable Ms. Tara Rivers. And we have the Chairman of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, Mr. Lemuel Hurlston. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the Premier to give his remarks, followed by the Minister and then by the Chairman of the Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Saku. Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming today to allow us to provide an update on the work of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee and to present their report, which has been titled, quite appropriately, Report on Establishing a Minimum Wage Regime in the Cayman Islands. As the press and indeed the country would be aware, the implementation of a national minimum wage was a key plank in the Progressives' manifesto and subsequently became a major goal of the government and indeed is in line with government's goal of equity and justice in a society that values the contributions of all, as noted when we presented the strategic policy statement in November 2013. And in delivering government's policy statement in the Legislative Assembly last May, I noted that, and I'm quoting from that statement now, the Progressives-led government also plans to introduce a minimum wage at a responsible and economically sustainable level to ensure that those on the lower end of the pay scale receive a minimum expected wage. And so this government, led by Minister Rivers in this instance, advised the country last year of the creation of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. The committee then went about the business of looking at the best way to implement a minimum wage in the Cayman Islands, and in doing so, to determine a responsible level to peg the wage at. The report contains the details on what was done and the methods used, as well as its recommendations. But I will leave the Minister, Chief Officer Saku, and the Chairman, Mr. Lem Hurlston, to discuss those as needed. But I am pleased today that we have arrived at this point where much hard work has been done to gather the data, do the necessary analysis, and to make careful and considered recommendations as provided in the report. I know that there are those who did not believe that this would get this far. There were also those who questioned the method used and suggested that we choose some unscientific gut feel number to peg a minimum wage at. But we knew better than to follow this folly. The public should, with this report, better understand the reason and importance for the approach taken. Hopefully any critics left standing will also gain this appreciation and work with us as we move forward with implementation. In terms of next steps, the report is now available to the public, and I'm sure that we will hear views over the coming weeks on its contents. Caucus and Cabinet has had a presentation regarding the report, and in the coming weeks will more carefully consider the recommendations made, including the proposed minimum wage rate, as well as the timing of the introduction of a minimum wage. Of course, we will also take note of whatever public feedback is received. I can say that our intention is to complete our deliberations and to be in a position to make an announcement regarding implementation at the time of the budget presentation in May of this year. I wish to thank Minister Rivers and her team, and I also wish to thank especially Chairman Lem Hurlston and his committee members for the many hours of dedicated work done on behalf of the country. Chairman Lem, your and your committee's contribution to this historic report is greatly appreciated. I have to also thank the business sector and the public for the valuable contributions made. And of course, I thank my very able government caucus team for supporting these efforts. It is important to recognize that, as Chairman Lem noted in his foreword to the report, and I am quoting now, "This is therefore the commencement of an ongoing exercise that should benefit the economy and labor relations in the future," unquote. There is still a lot of work that will need to be done finalize these efforts, but this is a major milestone and accomplishment. I will now turn over to Minister Rivers and the team for their comments before opening the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Premier. And good morning, everyone that is here in attendance and everyone that is listening to the radio and watching us on TV. It gives me great pleasure to present this report to the public today. Today really does mark history for this country. Today, we have now arrived at a point where we can have an informed discussion, and the government can now make an informed decision about the implementation of a national minimum wage regime based on solid quantitative, qualitative, statistical, and economic analysis conducted by the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee and guided by the International Labour Organization's technical advisor using the ILO's internationally accepted methodology. Over the last 30 years, and in particular the last 15 years, there has been many and various national discussions around the issue of a minimum wage, or the lack thereof, in the Cayman Islands. In fact, back in 2001, the government of the day passed a motion regarding the establishment of a minimum wage. However, nothing was done subsequently at that time to move the process forward beyond just passing the motion. Similarly, 10 years later, in 2011, the UDP administration accepted a motion to establish a national minimum wage of $5 per hour. However, again, nothing was done by the government of the day to take the process forward beyond the talk and the passing of the motion. Yet the provisions to establish a minimum wage has existed in the labor law since the law was first enacted in 1987. And in fact, the now superseded minimum wage law of 1946 contained essentially similar provisions enabling the administrator of the islands at the time to appoint advisory boards for the purpose of advising and assisting in the establishing of a minimum wage regime. So, ladies and gentlemen, the process by which to establish a minimum wage regime has been well entrenched in our laws for well over 50 years. There has been ample time and opportunities for various government administrations over the years to do something about the issue, if any of them were serious about doing something about the issue. Yet, this is the first time that any government has done and has had the fortitude to carry out the process and to move beyond just talking about the issue. And, I would add, it took a coalition government to achieve this. We can now finally move beyond just talking about the issue without the benefit of understanding the implications to the labour market and to those most affected. As the independent member of Cabinet and the Minister responsible for Labour, last February, with less than 1 year in office, I gave a commitment on behalf of the government in the Legislative Assembly that the legally mandated process of establishing a minimum wage would be taken forward and would be carried out. In just over a year, today, I have delivered on the commitment made on behalf of the PPM-led coalition government. As the Premier indicated earlier, it is now up to the government as a whole to consider the recommendations of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee and to take the matter forward. However, ladies and gentlemen, none of this would be possible without the hard work, the dedication, and commitment of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee and the staff of the Ministry of Education, Employment, and Gender Affairs, which supported the work of the committee throughout the process. I, too, would like to sincerely thank the chair and the members of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee and the staff of the ministry that acted as a secretariat to the committee. This really was a concerted effort on the part of the government and the committee to see us get to this point. The ministry diverted a lot of resources in terms of supporting the committee and the work of the committee in order to complete the report within the very aggressive timeline that was set by Cabinet. And we thank, and I publicly thank the members of the ministry for doing so. But also, I'd like to thank the Minister of Finance and the Ministry of Finance for allowing the services of the Economics and Statistics Officer assigned to the committee, Mr. Adolphus Laidlow, and the work that he did in getting us to this point and allowing the necessary time and effort in order to finalize the report. I think I'd like to bring to the attention again of the public that this really was a concerted effort by the government as a whole, and as the Premier said, supported by members of caucus in that regard. Last year, during my debate on the issue of the Legislative Assembly, I indicated that the determination of an appropriate national minimum wage structure for the Cayman Islands must be based on well-informed socioeconomic principles, research, and analysis. Therefore, the terms of reference of the committee were expansive, with the committee being tasked to address a number of questions, such as, should there be one basic minimum wage or separate minimum wages based on industry or other economic sector differentiation? Should there be different minimum wages established according to age, with special consideration to any differentiation needed for young people? Should there be differentiated minimum wages established for Caymanians compared to non-Caymanians? Should other appropriate pay components, such as gratuities and in-kind payments, such as housing, food, etc., be used in calculating a minimum wage? Should a minimum wage apply to workers in the non-governmental, non-for-profit, and charitable organizations? These are some of the questions, to name a few, that the committee was asked to consider and to provide recommendations as it relates to those questions. In appointing the committee, the government was keen to ensure that membership of the committee was gender balanced and that it represented the views of employees as well as employers, and also the views of other independent stakeholders. And the members also were asked to recognize the contributions of and challenges related to young people in relation to labor. The report on establishing a minimum wage regime in the Cayman Islands is over 100 pages long, and that does not include the executive summary and supporting annexes. And it contains the full details of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee's recommendations for a minimum wage figure and the components necessary for a minimum wage regime to be implemented in the Cayman Islands. This is the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee's report and the recommendations, and which is based on extensive research and analysis conducted by the committee with the assistance of the ILO. As such, I will now turn it over to the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee to speak about the details of the report and to share the committee's recommendations in this regard.
Thank you, Honorable Minister Rivers. I am very pleased that this assignment was successfully completed on schedule and within budget. I am most grateful to the members of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, and especially to the Secretariat and the Technical Subcommittee that performed tirelessly to assist the work of the committee and the writing of its final report. We must also convey our sincere appreciation to all those organizations, companies, and individuals who participated in the public consultation throughout the exercise. The process. During the assignment, the committee received technical guidance from the International Labour Organization and engaged in a robust and holistic public consultation process to gather data and opinions which contributed to the recommendations in the final report. The committee was supported by a technical consultant, Mr. Reynolds Simmons from the International Labour Organization, Decent Work Team, and Office for the Caribbean, who was the senior specialist for employment and labor market policies. The technical guidance from the ILO assisted the committee greatly in understanding the necessary issues to consider when determining a minimum wage, the limitations of the data which we had to work with, and possible methods in which to derive at a figure for the minimum wage recommendation. Mr. Simmons has extensive knowledge of minimum wage setting and implementation and produced a report entitled Statistical Aspects to Setting the Minimum Wage in the Cayman Islands, which is Annex 1 of the Minimum Wages Report. Mr. Simmons' report provided a comprehensive review of available statistical sources and data and options for the committee to consider when setting the minimum wage. Much of Mr. Simmons' report was used in developing the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee's report, and many of the recommendations proposed by Mr. Simmons in his report were supported by the committee and form part of the recommendations outlined in the report. In addition to receiving technical guidance provided by the ILO, another key element of the process of this exercise was the holistic public consultation conducted by the committee. As Minister Rivers indicated, the committee had a very extensive terms of reference, and it was asked to fulfill for this project. One of the items of the terms of reference was to hold discourse with the people of the Cayman Islands and to use a variety of multimedia tools in order to gather relevant information from stakeholders. The public consultation process involved different activities at various stages of the exercise. I will provide a broad overview of the types of consultation conducted. 1, meetings with key stakeholders were held with organizations such as the Chamber of Commerce and their guests from the International Labour Organization, also Mrs. Ann Knowles, Senior Specialist Employers and Activities, the Department of Children and Family Services and their Needs Assessment Unit, the Cayman Islands Tourism Association, the Cayman Islands Contractors Association, and others. 2, focus group meetings were held in Cayman Brac and Grand Cayman to collect qualitative data and to explore people's beliefs, attitudes, and opinions on the subject of a minimum wage. The focus groups targeted household and business employers, household and business employees, unemployed Caymanians, and the youth. 3, district town hall meetings were held in Cayman Brac and all districts in Grand Cayman. 4, written submissions were invited from the general public and non-governmental organizations. 5 surveys were designed to solicit opinions on the topic of the minimum wage, ask about probable behaviors in relation to the implementation of a minimum wage, and collect personal data such as income of employees and pay rates used by employers. The surveys targeted business employers, business employees, household employers, household employees, and the general public, including unemployed Caymanians. The surveys were administered online through SurveyMonkey. Printed copies were in all district libraries, including Cayman Brac and Little Cayman's post office, and administered in the field to a randomly selected individual group of businesses by trained enumerators contracted through the assistance of the Economic and Statistics Office. A total of 568 persons took part in the online surveys, and a total of 2,097 surveys were administered by representatives of the Economic and Statistics Office. These numbers reflect the amount of fully and partially completed surveys. In total, the committee received feedback or representation from 2,792 people and organizations. From the public consultation process, the committee received clear support for the establishment of a minimum wage for the Cayman Islands, with 89% stating yes, 5.4% stating no, and 5.6% saying don't know or not sure. While the general public has indicated clear support for the establishment of a minimum wage, it would seem that based on public feedback and opinions provided to the committee during the process, that the public is, however, thinking in terms of a living wage as opposed to a minimum wage. And there is a distinct difference between the two. A minimum wage, as defined by the International Labour Organization, is a sum payable to a worker for work performed or services rendered within a given period or collective agreement, which is governed by law and which may be fixed in such a way as to cover the minimum needs of the worker and his or her family in the light of national, economic, and social conditions. A living wage, on the other hand, is based on the basic cost of living in a country or area in a country and is not enforceable by law, and there is no universally accepted definition of a living wage or agreement on how to calculate it. Out of the 2,097 respondents to the survey, to the field surveys, 80.2% identified cost of living as the most important factor in determining a minimum wage, and age was identified as the least important factor, with only 10.2% indicating it was most important. Based on the importance of the cost of living placed by those who participated in the public consultation, it is anticipated that some persons will not be satisfied with the committee's recommended figure. And going off script, I can say that this, of course, is their democratic right. While the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee wants to ensure that all people in the islands have a decent standard of living, the committee did not focus on a living wage, but followed the terms of reference for the project, which was to identify a minimum wage that would fulfill one of the objectives of the exercise, which was to address exploitation and provide real relief to the lowest paid workers. It is important to note that the minimum wage should take into account the balance between the needs of the individual and his or her family, that is the employee, and the needs of the economy and the affordability to meet the cost, the employers. Therefore, setting the minimum wage requires a balancing act to ensure that there is economic stability, but at the same time allowing people to meet their basic needs. Identification of low-wage employees. The ILO consultant, Mr. Simmons, identified in his report that employees earning very low wages and low wages make up 29% of all employees in the Cayman Islands workforce. Of that 29%, very low wages make up 7% and were defined as employees in the labor force survey who earned less than $4.61 per hour, and for low wages constituted 22%, defined as employees who earned between $4.62 and $9.23 per hour. There are 2.6 times more Caymanian workers than Caymanians in the very low and low wage segments, and the four industries that employ 72.3% of all very low wage earners are: 1. Wholesale and retail trade, repair of motor vehicles and motorcycles; 2. Restaurants and mobile service activities; 3. Administration and support activities, including security guards; and 4. Activities of households as employers, which includes domestic helpers and other elementary occupations. The 5 industries that employ 70.3% of all low-wage earners are: 1. Wholesale and retail trade, repair motorcycles and vehicles; 2. Restaurants and mobile service activities; 3. Administration support services activities; 4. Activities of households as employers; and 5. Construction. It is important to note that a third of the very low and low wage earners are in industries outside these 5 identified categories. Therefore, if a minimum wage was set only for the 5 very low and low wage industries, this would exclude this third of very low and low wage earners, amongst which many are Caymanians. 2,683 Caymanians are classified as very low or low wage employees, 655 as very low, and 2,028 as low paid employees. Therefore, Caymanians make up 27.6% of the very low or low wage segment of our labor market. The committee unanimously agreed to recommend that the minimum wage should be a national minimum wage that is applied across the board to all sectors of employment in the Cayman Islands in order to ensure that no low-income earning Caymanians in these sectors outside of the 5 identified would be excluded, and that as many low-paid employees are covered as possible. Recommended minimum wage. Based on the analysis of the data provided from the committee's public consultation exercise and various other national data sources, the committee recommends 6 Cayman Island dollars gross per hour as an acceptable introductory minimum wage rate that would achieve the objective of addressing exploitation and providing real relief to the lowest paid workers. The suggested application of this national minimum wage rate applies as follows. An across-the-board rate applicable to all employees as defined in the labor law, including employees in the household, domestic, and employees of non-profit and charitable organizations, applies equally to Caymanians and non-Caymanians. No age distinctions. The minimum wage rate applies equally to persons of all ages who are legally defined as employees in the labor law. Does not apply to self-employed persons. Applies to every hour worked, either within the standard work week or standard work day as defined in the labor law. The committee also recommends that special provisions are given to employers in relation to gratuity and commissions and for household employers who employ living employees. The special provisions are as follows. No more than 25% of the $6 minimum wage gross rate, that is $1.50, may be paid by gratuities or commissions. Therefore, at least 75% of the minimum wage rate must come directly from employers. This exception is only applicable to businesses that have a scheme in accordance with the gratuities regulations and are in good standing and has received the approval in writing of the Director of Labor and Pensions in accordance with the current labor law and regulations. Recognizing that the household as employer industry will be the most affected by the introduction of a minimum wage regime, a maximum of 25% or $1.50 of any in-kind credit for accommodations and utilities only may be applied to the $6 per hour gross minimum wage rate, but only for households, employers with live-in employees. The committee also recommends that gratuities and commission-based employers are required to provide at the very least a minimum wage rate when calculating an employee's vacation, sick, maternity, or paternity leave, etc. The committee considers that this minimum wage regime as a simple and easily understood system for enforcement to begin with, and it considers the recommended $6 per hour gross rate to be fair and a conservative wage that would be affordable to employers and beneficial to very low-wage employees. The committee also recommends that the first minimum wage regime errs on the side of caution by starting at a conservative rate, as it is easier to increase an existing minimum wage rate than it is to lower one. The recommended minimum wage is only valid for 1 year after the date of this report, which will be February 2016, and the committee also recommends a 6-month period from the date the minimum wage is established in the labor law to the date when it is enforceable. An annual review of the minimum wage for effectiveness by technical experts and a quadrennial review by future minimum wage advisory committees for fixing procedures and criteria is also recommended. Legislative amendments and other recommendations. In order to implement the suggested minimum wage regime, the committee also made suggestions for various legislative amendments to be made to the current version of the labor law. Additionally, the committee has made suggestions for other legislative changes that do not exist currently within legislation. These suggestions apply to the labor law regulations, the labor law, and the immigration law, including the following recommendations. The provision of a template for information returns to the Department of Labor and Pensions, the introduction of an administrative fines regime, the introduction of whistleblower provisions, ensuring that contracts of employment accompany all work permit applications, and reference to the employer accreditation system or scheme when introduced. Additionally, the committee provided recommendations for synergies to be developed with recommendations that would be necessary to support a strong regime, including the additional human resources necessary for effective enforcement. These suggestions include actions to address the following issues: improve current data collection methods, consider new data collection methods, further analysis and research of unemployment with high school and university education and long-term employment, review government policies, that is, temporary poor relief policies and immigration department policies that will influence the effectiveness of the regime, increase information sharing among government entities, identify methods to leverage other institutional capabilities and relationships within government, increase attention, public awareness, and/or public education efforts on 3 key issues identified from focus groups, which data were: 1, high level of exploitation and contractual breaches among low-paid workers; 2, address stereotyping of Caymanians as lazy and not good workers; and 3, addressing young persons' attitudes of not wanting to work in certain industries. Calculating the minimum wage and the economic impact. In order to decide on the minimum wage, there must be an established, nationally recognized poverty line or vulnerability threshold that is agreed to that no one in the country should earn below. However, given that the Cayman Islands do not have a formally recognized poverty line, the committee had to determine what it would use as its floor rate. The committee agreed that the minimum wage should be set above any kind of suggested poverty or vulnerability line threshold. Therefore, the committee established the Cayman Islands Economic Vulnerability Threshold, the acronym being CIEVT. The CIEVT rate is the minimum amount that a worker needs to earn in order not to slip below the poverty line, and this was determined in this instance to be $5.22 per hour per income earner. This hourly rate equates to $905 per month or $10,859 per annum. Having agreed upon the CIEVT as the established poverty threshold, the committee also analyzed the wages currently paid to employees through the Economic and Statistic Office's labor force surveys and the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee's minimum wage surveys administered to businesses and households. In order to avoid driving wage distribution upward, thereby impacting negatively on macroeconomic stability and employment levels, the committee analyzed the low value-added industry's ability to pay a minimum wage that was greater than the CIEVT figure of $5.22 per hour. This data analysis assisted the committee in determining its recommended figure, which it believes does decrease the exploitation of labor and provide some relief to the lowest paid workers. And importantly, low-paying industries have the capacity to afford the costs and to make the payments. Data from the Economic and Statistics Office Labor Force Survey 2013 shows that 2,367 employees were earning less than $4.61 per hour. In other words, approximately 6.5% of our workforce was earning less than $5.22 per hour. The $6 per hour proposed minimum wage will directly benefit an estimated 5,962 employed persons, which is 15.8% of the entire employed labor force currently in the Cayman Islands. 3,362 are business employees and 2,600 are household employees. 1,524 or 25.6% are Caymanians and 4,438 or 74.4% are non-Caymanians. Household employees, that is domestic workers, will benefit the greatest with an estimated wage increase of $1.86 per employee per hour. In this group, there are 169 Caymanians, about 6.5%, and 2,431 non-Caymanians, 93.5%. Employees in the other occupations would receive the following estimated wage increases per hour. Administrative and support service activities, including security guards, janitorial, cleaning services, car rentals, etc., $1. Accommodation establishments, 54 cents. Restaurants and mobile services, $1.11. The overall direct cost of the proposed minimum wage is $17.6 million in annual terms. Of this, businesses will be required to pay $7.54 million, and households will be required to pay $10.06 million. Of the $7.54 million that it will cost the business sector, the benefits to employees who work for businesses will be $3.88 million for Caymanians and $3.65 million for non-Caymanians. Small businesses, that is firms with less than 5 employees, will be the most impacted with payments of approximately 1,233 employees. These businesses account for 36.7% of all employees of businesses who are earning less than the proposed minimum wage. Businesses with 50 or more employees will see higher payments to 691 employees. That is 20.6%. Of the $10.06 million that it will cost households, the benefits to employees who work for household as employers will be Caymanians, $0.4 million or 4%, non-Caymanians, $9.66 million, 96%. The estimated overall job losses as a result of the proposed minimum wage could range from 545 to 600 persons, or 1.4 to 1.6% of the total employed, which is plus or minus 5%. This would be an estimated 190 household employees and an estimated 382 business employees. It is assumed that these potential job losses will exclusively affect work permit holders rather than Caymanians and permanent residents, although, of course, the employers of persons potentially losing jobs will be, in many cases, Caymanians or permanent residents. The following two assumptions or scenarios outline the estimated impact on the consumer price index and inflation. 1. If the entire 100% additional cost to businesses is passed through to consumers in the form of higher prices of goods and services, it is estimated that a 0.85% increase in the consumer price index will occur. The strongest impact is expected in an increase in housing and utilities of 0.28% and a 0.13% increase in miscellaneous goods and services sectors. Scenario 2. If 50% of the business's employers' additional costs are passed through by price increases, the average consumer price index inflation is estimated at 0.58%, with housing and utilities contributing approximately 0.19%. In relation to the impact of implementing this minimum wage rate on GDP growth, the following are the two of the more important and most likely scenarios that we have considered. If businesses can only pass on 50% of the additional cost to consumers, coupled with Caymanians spending 100% of the additional income in the local economy, whilst non-Caymanians spend 50%, then gross domestic product growth is anticipated to increase by 0.74%, while inflation-adjusted GDP growth is expected at 0.16%. If 572 of the estimated layoffs are non-Caymanians, and the remaining non-Caymanians retain their jobs and spend 50% of the additional income, and employed Caymanians continue to spend 100% of their additional income, then the expected result is zero current GDP growth. The most favorable impact on economic growth would, of course, be if all additional earnings are spent locally with no employee layoffs. Economic growth would then be expected to be enhanced by 1.19%, while economic growth adjusted for inflation caused by higher prices from cost pass-through will be an additional 0.33%. I'm sorry to have bored you with so much statistics, but I thank you for your time and attention, and that concludes my overview.
Thank you, Mr. Hurlston. I would also especially like to thank you in terms of your leadership of the committee. I'd also like to thank all of the members of the committee for committing to a very tight time frame and a very tight budget, and for delivering on time within budget an exemplary report. By providing research, technical, and administrative support throughout this project, the staff from our ministry served as a secretariat of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. I would like to thank Ms. Tammy Ebanks, especially, Ministry Liaison to the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, for her diligence during this project, and to the other civil servants from the ministry who comprise the secretariat, and also to the ex officio committee members from other government entities, including the Economics and Statistics Office, the Immigration Department, and the Department of Labor and Pensions. I would also like to thank various organizations and individuals that took part in this exercise. I believe that the report provided by the committee gives us the necessary analysis and information that will usefully serve the government in a decision-making process on establishing a minimum wage in the Cayman Islands, and I congratulate the committee on a job well done. As was announced previously, the final budget spent by the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee for this project from June 2014 to March 2015 was just under $80,000 CI. The ministry had allocated $200,000 to this project, and significant savings were achieved as a result of the international labor organizations providing the consultancy free of charge, with the government only paying for travel, accommodation, and per diem for the consultant's mission visit to Grand Cayman. I would therefore especially like to thank the ILO and Mr. Reynolds Simmons for his expert advice and consultancy during this project. A more detailed budget for this entire exercise is included as an annex to the committee's report, and I would like to announce that the committee's report will be available today on the ministry's website starting at noon. The website address is www.education.gov.ky/minimum wage. The functionality for comments has been enabled, and therefore the public will be able to provide commentary, and I would like to encourage members of the public to go through the report and provide feedback to the ministry. Give us your thoughts on the recommendations made by the committee and on the other items outlined in their report. That concludes our presentation this morning, and I'd like to open the floor to questions from the media.
Okay, good morning. Let me start off with the Premier first. I'm sure we all have a number of questions, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. You said that you hope to bring this in time for the budget by May in terms of a minimum wage.
I hope to be able to make an announcement.
An announcement about
As the chairman has pointed out, there are a number of logistical things that have to happen, including changes to legislation and so forth. So we have to sit down and work out what the time frame will be to effect all of those things.
Can you give a commitment, though, that there will be a minimum wage implemented in spite of pushback from various sectors of the community?
Yes, there will be a minimum wage implemented. Or
will it take the shape of the $6 suggested?
Well, those are some of the issues that the caucus and the cabinet are still considering. There are essentially two issues, aside from the timing, one and how quickly we can get the various legislative amendments through. But there's one, the amount, and the other is when it actually takes effect. So those are the two issues really that cabinet and caucus still have to work through, as I said, aside from the logistical issues and the timing of getting through legislative changes.
You just preempted my next question in terms of making sure this becomes enforced. Is there a time frame you might be looking at once you announce it? When would employers have, what would the window look like for employers to make sure that this is done?
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons why we would like feedback, because obviously business community in particular and actually households need time to adjust and to plan for the implementation of a minimum wage. So those are some of the factors that are still being considered and will be considered over this period while we receive, we hope, considerable feedback.
Are you anticipating a pushback from the business community in particular?
Actually, no, I'm not, because of the broad consultation that has taken place, and the fact that the Chamber of Commerce in particular has been involved in this process.
Is the chamber supporting $6 an hour?
Well, I don't know if I can comment on what they are supporting in terms of a number. Maybe the chairman can, or one of the technical people. But I would think that they would regard that as a fair figure. I think where the biggest issues are going to come from are from the households, probably more than the businesses, because we know, those of us who are around know that there has been and continues to be real exploitation at that level. I personally know of helpers, as we call them, who are getting paid like $60 a week, and so those sorts of things are going to those sorts of areas are going to be areas where I think we will get some pushback. Also, I expect that some of the local businesses, in particular, that are paying waitresses and bartenders and so forth $3.50 and $4 an hour, there'll be some adjustment necessary in terms of their perspective. But we take the view that social justice requires that we pay people a minimum wage, and I think everybody would be impressed. I certainly have been overwhelmed by the care and research and thought and professionalism that has gone into the preparation of this report. You heard the detail that was provided by the chairman, and I think the government really would have to think long and hard before we would reject recommendations that have been so carefully thought out and considered.
Is there a possibility of rejection?
Reduction?
Rejection of the
There's always a possibility of rejection. This is a political issue. But the entire caucus has supported this initiative. And as I said, we just want to take the same care and apply the same thought that has gone into the report to our decisions about the implementation.
Okay, my last question. I won't hog the mic anymore. It's for Mr. Hurlston. When you were in the process of doing this, compiling this report, you had a number of meetings. You had expressed then that there was disappointment over the turnout by people. How did that factor into the compiling of this report? Did you have to, focus heavily on the surveys received as well as ESO statistics? Do you think you had enough to come up with the figures in this report?
Yes, certainly we had enough. There was a point in the process in which we were disappointed in the turnout at specific events and forums, but I've been around long enough to know that public attendance in the Cayman Islands, public attendance at public meetings is not something that is flocked to any longer. And so the average turnout at a public meeting, no matter what the topic is, tends to be on the low side, and we were disappointed but not surprised.
And that didn't impact the findings?
Has not impacted it whatsoever.
Morning, everyone. I don't know whether it's on. Is it on? Obviously, there doesn't seem to be any great rejection by either the minister or the premier over the $6 an hour. I presume that you're neither surprised and probably agree with it to a certain extent. Do you see any possibility during the process of caucus that it could actually be even more?
Well, I mean, I think that as the Premier said, the discussion needs to happen with respect to the implementation phase. And as the Premier said, this is a political issue. And so ultimately the government will have to make that determination. But from my perspective, as I said, when we did have the debate in the House on the motion and I was responsible for giving the response on behalf of the government, it was important from the government's perspective that we actually had solid foundation to make those determinations or to have those deliberations. And as you've heard here today, the extent of the research, the extent of the analysis, the extent of the considerations and assumptions that have been made has really helped us to be able to have those informed discussions and informed decision making. So with respect to whatever the figure is, that is still obviously a determination that the caucus and the government will have to make. But certainly, we will be looking very closely at the report and looking to see how that can continue to assist us in making those determinations.
And just one more question, which is a more general question. I think some of the things that Mr. Hurlston and the committee found out were perhaps quite revealing. I don't think people probably realised. Were you, as political representatives of the people, shocked or surprised in any way to find out how many people are affected by minimum wage here, given the size, given how wealthy we're considered to be in the rest of the Caribbean?
Quite frankly,
I'll hand over the mic now.
Quite frankly, in my case, not really. I have a fairly good feel for what transpires at that level in the market. And indeed, the number that they've recommended of $6 an hour is a number that I was carrying in my head, just based on feedback that I get on a daily basis from how things are in the workplace and in the market. But I think the more important point is the one I wish on the line, the one made by the minister, is that we could have gone along with some of the suggestions that, for instance, the member from Northside made. Just plug in a $5 an hour and let's roll. This doesn't require a great deal of research. We know what it is. We don't believe in operating that way. And the committee haven't done the work it's done, taken the advice it's taken. I would be very loath on my part to reject the findings and recommendations of the committee and substitute some other figure which one or other or all of us come up with, because we think that's a better figure. I'm much more compelled by the scientific analysis that has gone on, the research that has gone on, and certainly, and I'll say this openly, my position and my recommendation to my caucus is that we accept the recommendations of the committee.
Ralph Lewis, Cayman Weekly, and this question is for the Honourable Minister Rivers. It's clear to me that at some point we will have a minimum wage implemented. Can you look into your crystal ball and say whether it will be done before the end of this year? Because businesses and homeowners will need some time to plan and manage their budget accordingly.
Well, thank you for that question. And I think I just want to, again, underscore the points that were made earlier with respect to taking us forward and moving forward. As Minister responsible for Labour, this was pretty much my domain to get us to this point, to say, okay, now we have a detailed analysis of the situation. We can now make that determination. When I say we, I have to stress this is a determination that needs to be made by the government as a whole. And so I am one member of the committee or of the government, but I also want to echo the fact that I do believe, and I'm really happy to have read the report and to see the type of details, the analysis, the questions that we posed were answered and were considered. And so it has given me greater comfort to be able to stand here and say that I too believe we need to look at this and to take this as where we want to start and look at ensuring that any decisions that we make about it, because of the impacts on business, because of the impacts on households, because of the impacts on employees themselves, it needs to be measured, it needs to be rational, and it needs to be deliberated. And we've got now a report in the form of this Minimum Wage Advisory Committee's report that has done just that. And so as a government, we can now make a rational decision. And as the Premier said, I too would be recommending to my colleagues that we look at this report and we look at the implementation mechanisms that the report also speaks to. Because as you will recall in my debate in the House, that was one of the concerns that the government and then myself as Minister responsible for Labour, how would this regime actually be implemented? Because the interest of just having a regime in place but not knowing the implications for implementation was something that I certainly wasn't prepared as Minister to support. Now we have a report that looks at that as well based on the terms of reference that was given, and we're much more able to say, well, in order to implement this, we need to make sure we have this. And so it does require certain budgetary requirements and other resource requirements. So, if the ministry, if we get the support of my colleagues in caucus and cabinet to put those resources in place, then we can look at the timeliness of when we can actually implement and make sure that we can enforce at the same time.
Ralph, just let me say this, give this assurance. As I think people would have worked out by now after 2 years of us being in office, we are not really prone to springing things upon an unsuspecting public. And so we will ensure that there is, when the decision is taken as to implementation, that there is sufficient notice is given, that businesses and households and so forth can plan and make the necessary adjustments, and so that this can be done without creating chaos and real economic turmoil.
Charles Duncan with the Compass. First, Mr. Hurlston, just to confirm, this would apply to people who are hired for an hourly wage and, say, a set salary, like, as the Premier said, $60 a week.
Yes, as long as the person being paid is not a self-employed individual, it does not. This regime does not apply to the self-employed, but it applies to everybody else, including all the other sectors. Yes.
And whoever wants to answer this one, where would enforcement be housed, and how would that work?
Yeah. Again, the institutions that the chair talked about, and some of the kind of regulatory changes that will be required would obviously impact the Department of Labor and Pensions. It would impact immigration and some other entities as well, which we would need to make sure that the structures that are in place currently, the reporting mechanisms, would be able to support having an implementation regime or an enforcement regime that actually makes the introduction of a minimum wage meaningful.
Carsley Fuller, Radio Cayman. You have to forgive me because I was scribbling, but it looks like 72% of the very low and the low wage workers are work permit holders. Considering the current climate with unemployment and underemployment, and you're looking at $10 million coming from the households, how can you assure Caymanians that this isn't something to be scared of? Because it looks like it's going to be coming out of their pocket. So how do you address that?
Well, the thing is that it really doesn't matter where people come from. People are people. And social justice requires, Christian principles require that we treat people fairly. And, one of the big concerns that many people have had, myself included, for many years, it's actually coined the term of importing poverty. I mean, those of us who move around will understand that we have households in Cayman, which house 5, 6, as many as 8 in some instances, very low paid imported labor. We don't even have to imagine what the social conditions are. I mean, people even talk, and not jokingly, of some groups of employees sleeping in shifts. The night shifts goes out to work, people go to sleep, they come back, other people, use the same bed. Those really are social conditions which have not done well for Cayman and do not bode well for the future. And we really have to change that. We really have to change that situation. And one of the other things I don't think that many people have considered is when you have these very, very low rates, which Caymanians are loath to, these occupations or positions which are paid very low rates, Caymanians are loath to do them. When the rates come up to at least the minimum wage of $6 an hour, it will, I believe, open the opportunity for more Caymanians to take up those jobs because they're now paying a wage, which they can actually survive on. So it's not, I don't think you can just look at it from the perspective of it's going to cost $10.8 million. That's the reality. You've got to bear in mind all of the socio-economic considerations, which are also part and parcel of the situation.
Kenneth Bryan from CNS. Good morning, everybody. Coming off of her question, is there any immigration violation for individuals to be here under what is considered to be poverty line, or was it CTEC line? why are we technically, like what you've said, importing poverty? If this report has identified that these people technically can't survive based on these rates, why are we giving them work permits in the first place, Premier?
Well, there is no legislation that deals with that. Immigration cannot tell an employer at present how much to pay or not pay. This is going to address that particular situation. You can't pay less than $6 an hour, if assuming this is the figure that we adopt. The present legislation doesn't deal with any of that. So what I understand has grown up over the past number of years is there's sort of an informal system of checking over at immigration. But they say you really can't survive at this sort of rate, and then they insist also on you're providing details of accommodations and so forth. One of the big problems, of course, is that immigration does not have the resources to properly check. When you got 22,000 work permits, it's very, very difficult to check each and every one of them to make sure that what's actually filled out on the accommodation form reflects the reality. I would say in many instances with respect to those that paid at the lower end of the market, what's actually written on the accommodation form does not reflect reality.
Are you then accepting that the immigration department will have to have some changes done if this report is accepted to accommodate those changes to make sure that we can identify the truth of what's happening? Because you just identified that they are not equipped enough to do so.
Well, this will, in many ways, this will actually ease the burden from that perspective, because the check now is to ensure whether or not people are actually complying with the law once a minimum wage is put into effect, that everybody is being paid at least the minimum wage.
Next question. What measuring tool will you guys be using to gauge the acceptance from the public about this report once you've released it? Is there any specific way other than just comments or stuff? Any particular tool you may use to measure the response from the public once you've got out this number 6 now?
Well, there's been a long consultation process already in place and very comprehensive. So this exercise now is not another consultation process. What we are looking for is feedback. And the feedback, I think Mr. Saku went through. I can't remember all the detail of it now, but maybe he would want to refresh people's memory about that. But there is a process in place so that those who have concerns and issues can feed the information to us. We know, of course, that if the organizations, Chamber of Commerce being an example, if they have concerns or issues, we will know fairly swiftly, because they'll not only come to us, but they'll probably grab the front page of the Compass. So we know how that goes.
All right, last 2 questions, Premier. Are you concerned about prices increasing from the business community? I'll give you an example. The elephant in the room here is, the supermarkets. Their wage earners are pretty low, probably actually below that $6 mark. And businesses are going to say, I need to recuperate the losses I'm going to have to pay in salaries and wages. They're going to increase their prices. Have you considered the effects of that, or have considered some level of price control or price gauging? Have you guys thought about that factor?
I think the chairman went into considerable detail about what the estimated impact will be in various scenarios on prices generally. If the businesses absorb 50% of it, I can't remember what the numbers were, but they were all less than 1% overall impact on costs. I expect in some particular areas we will see some, and this is just based on not on me having an economic or training in economics, but just based on my usage, shall I say it, of the services and attendance at various businesses in Cayman. I expect that there will be some adjustments made to prices in areas where they rely very heavily on low-paid employees. Obvious examples, local bars, restaurants, where we know in many instances the people are being paid significantly less than $6 an hour. I expect really that that's where we're going to see the greatest impact on changes in prices. But that's just me, not even anecdotally, but just based on my experience. That's where I expect to see complaints coming from, and that's where I expect to see some price increases.
Mr. Bryan, sorry, before you continue, can I just ask Adolphus Laidlow to provide additional technical information in regards to your question?
Yes. Last question. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to give you an idea, though, that your question pertains to the supermarkets and changes in increases in price as a result of the suggested minimum wage. Currently, the wholesale and retail sector average wage rate is at $7.70, which simply means they're already paying higher than the suggested minimum wage. So it's only a small proportion of their employees may benefit from such a minimum wage, or in other words, affected by it. Just to give you an idea of some of the other sectors, the construction sector is currently paying $9.80, which is also above the minimum wage. Hotel and restaurants, as the Premier alluded, is in the area of $4.90. Administrative and support services, which are really like renting of motor vehicles and landscaping and those kind of firms, are paying $5.90. Other services, which include households, in some cases, households, hairdressing, beauty parlor, and things like that, are paying $7.20 on the average. Also, from the surveys that we did, business employees are currently, the low paid ones that is, are currently receiving an average of $6.57. The household employers said they're already paying $6.01 on average. And the household employees also said that they're receiving an average $6.24. So what it gives is that although $6 may be suggested from the committee side, most of the sectors that we are talking about already average higher than the $6. So a lot of them are really not affected as a result.
Thank you, Mr. Laidlow. Mr. Bryan, we take your last question now, sir.
Last question. Mr. Houston, the CIVET rate, how did you calculate it? And also the poverty line rate, why was it not considered in calculating?
Okay, we went through quite an elaborate process, which is described in more detail in the body of the report. Once you've had a chance to read it, we've defined the various elements, both of the poverty line and the vulnerability line, and the particular one that we designed for Cayman and gave it a Caymanian name. We've described how we arrived at that process. And the process began by firstly looking at an old 2007 report that was done on the assessment of living conditions, I think it was called, in the Cayman Islands. We began by looking at that data, updating that for movements in the consumer price index since it was written, looked at the economic context in which that was arrived at. And once we arrived at the sort of initial poverty line figure, we then multiplied that by 125%, which is an internationally recommended norm for calculating the vulnerability line, so that the vulnerability line is 125% of your poverty line. And that is how we then arrived at the Cayman vulnerability position. But it's more fully described in the body of the report, which I'm sure you will enjoy reading.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your questions. We're out of time, unfortunately.
One quick question. Just give
we
me one
have
quick
to
question.
wrap up.
All right, very quickly. Job loss. You talked about nearly 600 people potentially losing jobs. Is this something that either of you, I'm talking to the elected officials here, have considered, the potential job loss and what that means?
Well, that is the estimate. That is potentially, essentially what I how I interpret that is that when some employers, whether they be household or businesses, are faced with the prospect that they're going to have to pay more than $4 an hour for this particular service. They may decide not to keep the helper or not to keep as many waitresses or bartenders or whatever the case may be. As I think the committee found, the vast majority of these positions that we believe may be subject to attrition are likely to be work permit holders. Obviously, that will impact the economy overall, but I think the impact will be marginal, and I think that's what they found as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. Thank you to those listening and watching on television and radio. This concludes today's press conference and presentation on the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee's presentation on establishing a minimum wage regime for the Cayman Islands. Once again, I'd like to encourage members of the public to provide feedback to the report, which will be available starting at midday today on the Ministry's website at www.education.gov.ky/minimum wage. Thank you and have a good day.